Hello, class. This is your professor, Dr. Brian Lippincott, and I'm going to teach you a class today about the connection of the great philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, Immanuel Kant, and Aristotle, and their relationship with Carl Jung and how it explains a lot of the issues that are going on in Jung's psychotherapy, and especially Eudaimonia, which we're going to discuss, which is human flourishing, performing at your full potential. So I'm going to dive right in, and I know we all want to survive and live at our full potential, so let's get going with the lecture. Let's get started. The psychoethical schema, reading Jung with Kant, Nietzsche, and Aristotle, with a direction towards change and philosophy and how to be a fully functioning human being according to the philosophers of history. And this is a lecture by Dr. Brian Lippincott. I'm a clinical psychologist, MFT, flow neuroscience coach, and author of Analytical Psychology and Family Systems. Thank you very much. Let's keep moving here. So here we start. Let's go here. Yes. Consciousness-based morality. It's one-sided. Consciousness-based, one-sided and rigid. And so it's like a machine that just cranks out things, and it's kind of all mechanistic and adulter et alter pars. The other side must be listened to. And that is a saying, the other side must be listened to. That's something that's going on in our country right now that we need to relate to. And we need to develop the democratic unconscious. Both sides need to be listened to. And maybe 3 or 4 or 5 sides need to be listened to. The responsible relationship. So we have this healing, the dark and the light interconnecting in this larger machine with heat and fire and everything. It's not cold and sterile like this one. The core thesis. Jung places the unconscious at the moral table. Morality. True ethics requires a system of checks and balances, as does our government require a system of checks and balances, where one part of the government, for instance, the president, just can't take over the whole thing. There has to be the courts. There has to be the legislature and the executive branch. They all have to work together. And the same thing goes on in our psyche. A responsible, dynamic partnership rather than totalitarian rule by conscious reason. Reason isn't everything. There's emotion, there's sensation, there's a lot of things in a human body, in a human system, in a human family or culture. Neurosis as moral failure. Yes, let's talk about that. The 8-page foreword that 74-year-old Carl Jung wrote for the book by his pupil, Erich Neumann, entitled Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, reveals both Jung's conviction of the necessity to reconsider the nature and scope of ethics, as well as his unwillingness to set down ethical theories and see himself as a philosopher. He writes, "The analyst learns that the ethical problems are always intensely individual, and that the collective rules of conduct offer at most provisional solutions, but never lead to those crucial decisions which are the turning points of a man's life. It is very difficult to formulate ethical rules, since one can hardly think of a single rule that would not have to be reversed under certain conditions." Jung goes on to define Neumann's expression, new ethic, as a development and differentiation within the old ethic, confined at present to the uncommon individuals who, driven by unavoidable conflicts of duty, endeavor to bring the conscious and the unconscious into a responsible relationship. So, neurosis as a moral failure. The psyche's self-division leads to mechanical breakdown. You see this heat? It's all coming to a stall. The conscious mind clings to a one-sided moral ideal, while the unconscious rebels with an unmoral pull. And as Jung said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. It's a substitute. For legitimate suffering you have to go through. The treatment of neurosis is, in the last resort, not a technical problem, but a moral one. The integration of the personality is unthinkable without the responsible. And that means moral relation to the parts with one another. The parts have to be something greater than the whole. Our country needs to be greater than the executive branch or the courts or the legislature. It all has to work together as a cohesive whole, not get stuck like this. Eric Neumann's new ethic of the individual Healing is not a clinical patch. It's not a band-aid. It is a moral imperative to unite the divided self. The engine of duty, the unconscious. The engine of duty and consciousness. The engine of duty and consciousness. Relative freedom. The ego must maintain autonomy from the amoral determination of the unconscious. Ego has to be an actor that does things. The relative ego. Danger. This is the danger. Psychic inflation. Thinking we're too big for our britches, as my mom used to say. Avoiding inflation. Too big. If the ego is assimilated by the raw power of the self, it results in a psychic catastrophe. It's like Jung had this client who was a mountain climber, and the guy was becoming so narcissistic, so inflated, nothing could stop me and all that, and Jung warned him, I wouldn't go climbing any big mountains when you have that kind of an attitude because bad things can happen. And Jung heard a week later that the guy, the mountain climber, had fell to his death. So that's inflation. It gets us thinking that we can do anything and then we can't do anything. The duty to be conscious. Jung transforms Kant's moral duty into conscientiousness. The ego's primary obligation is the arduous task of remaining fiercely conscious. So, reinterpreting Kant versus Kant uses the ought implies can. Ought implies can't. I said it again. Utilizes ought implies can argument in various writings. For example, in the Metaphysics of Morals, he writes, and this is Kant, impulses of nature accordingly involve obstacles within the human being's mind to his fulfillment of duty and sometimes powerful forces opposing it. Two sides. That was my parenthetical remark, which he must judge that he is capable of resisting and conquering by reason, not at some time in the future, but at once, the moment he thinks of duty. He must judge that he can do what the law tells him unconditionally and that he ought to. When Jung states that the ego ought to enter progressively in consciousness relationship to itself and progressively integrate its potential, he uses the Kantian ought implies can argument, according to which the categorical imperative can only oblige us to do what is possible. The categorical imperative is Kant's idea that basically the golden rule, that you want to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if something is really a categorical imperative, nobody should do it, like murder, things like that. Whenever a sense of moral inferiority appears, it indicates not only a need to assimilate an unconscious component, but also the possibility of each assimilation. If Kant was inflexible about the possibility of obeying the moral law, he was also famously critical of moral enthusiasm derived from the exhortations of others. By exhortations to actions, as noble, sublime, magnanimous minds are attuned to nothing but moral enthusiasm and exaggerated self-conceit. By such exhortations, they are led into the delusion that is not duty, which constitutes the determining ground of their actions. But if those actions were expected from them as bare merit, Jung is close to Kant's idea and language when he writes, having learnt by long and painful experience the relative ineffectiveness of trying to incalculate moral precepts, the therapist has to abandon all admonitions and exhortations that begin with ought and must. Kant and Jung seem to be involved in the same paradox. Both believe that an ethical and moral outlook ought to be discovered autonomously, but they cannot refrain from telling their readers that the discovery of the moral and ethical outlook is precisely what they ought to do. And we're talking about that, moral inferiority. When a patient experiences a profound sense of moral inferiority and ought, it is not merely a source of shame. It acts as a diagnostic indicator. The distress inherently involves the existence of corresponding hidden structural capacity, a can, to assimilate the dark shadow component into the consciousness. So we need to move beyond, and we need to do the can of integrating our shadow, the shadow of duty. Kant's famous opening statement in The Groundwork of Metaphysical Morals claims that it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will. But perhaps it is less known that Kant is also fully aware of the difficulty in discovering one's own motives. Yes, it's hard to figure out. It acts as a diagnostic indicator. The distress inherently proves the existence of a corresponding hidden capacity, a can to assimilate that dark shadow component into consciousness. So this is our pattern here that we need to follow. There's an irresolvable moral conflict there. We need to not just go one way or the other, or don't do anything, or that kind of thing. We need to hold the tension of the opposites. And that will lead to the transcendent function where we rise above. So we need to hold that tension. Kant denied irresolvable conflicts of duty, but Jung embraced them as the forge of ethical solution, a creative third element emerging from the unconscious under extreme pressure. Yes, the furnace of vitality and health. Now, the furnace of vitality and health, the herd, repression, conformity, cowardice. That's just going along with the herd. You see, it's like an assembly line. They all look the same. The free spirit, self-legislation, conscious scrutiny, excessive adaptation to collective standards is psychologically unhealthy. True ethics requires the vitality to endure the instinctual, irrational elements of one's own unique personality. The shadow of ethics and self-love. And that goes back when we're dealing with philosophy and Jungian psychology, only 3 authors have considered the ethical aspects of Jung's Kantian legacy. They're Marilyn Nagy, Paul Bishop, and Romero Madera. Now, Marilyn Nagy was my analyst for 10 years when I was a young man. And even though my wife and my kids never met her, because it was all analytical, it was individual, they would kiss her feet because she made me such a stronger man. She made me a better father. She made me into a better human because she would challenge me. I would have to go out in my car in Palo Alto out of her office, and I couldn't drive home for an hour to Salinas because I was just crying all the time. She would really, I called her the bee, not the bee what you think, the bee like the stinging bee, the bumblebee, because she would just hit me with these stingers that would really call my shadow into question and make me confront the shadow and she created in me the ethics of self-love, that I had to be compassionate to myself. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her in her book. Nagy's book, I called it, Marilyn's book, looks at Jung's early reception of Kant in his 1896 to 1899 lectures and explores the presence of Kantian themes in the Esse de Anima argument, the essence of the anima. Nagy shows how in Jung's Zofinga lectures, one finds Kant's conviction that through our experience of innate moral knowledge, we come as close as is humanly possible to knowledge of the reality of itself. Nagy discusses how Jung uses Kant's. Nagy discusses how Kant uses, let me start that over. Nagy discusses how Jung uses Kant's moral philosophy to strengthen Jung's Esse and Anima argument. Jung's Esse and Anima argument becomes, through his stretching of Kant's thought, what I suggest could be called an essay in anima morale argument. In Kant's model, ethics provides access to noumenal reality, to that higher level of reality, to that self-love. For Jung, the withdrawal of projections and the integrated of the shadow allows us to see the world as it is for the first time and to act ethically. On a different note, from Nagi's work, Bishop's monograph in 2000 highlights the contrast between Jung and Kant on the difference between knowledge and belief. Bishop, in his introduction to the second edition, Kant has claimed that he had found it necessary to annul knowledge in order to make room for belief. But Jung reverses Kant's formula. I think belief should be replaced by understanding. Then we should keep the beauty of the symbol, but still remain free from the depressing results of submission to belief. This would be the psychoanalytic cure for belief and disbelief. So, yes, so the entanglement of good and evil, as I was just talking about, good and evil are inextricably. Good and evil are inextricably linked. They're interconnected. Moral growth requires keeping them close together in dynamic tension. So you have the good and the light on this side flowing in, and you have the shadow and the evil on this side flowing in. Withdrawing the projection, we must consciously burn our dark fuel, selfishness and resentment, rather than projecting it into others. True self-love. Confronting the shadow is an ethical prerequisite. To love oneself is to accept and regulate the whole machine, not just the polished exterior. We got to relate to the whole car, the engine and everything, not just the exterior that looks good. The gyroscope of flourishing and wisdom. Yes, let's talk about that for a little bit. And what we're talking about is eudaimonia. Aristotle, and this is from Aristotle, notes that everybody agrees that the highest of all goods achievable by action is happiness, or eudaimonia. And that's what we really call flourishing now. We translate eudaimonia not so much as happiness, but as flourishing. But there is disagreement about what happiness is. Aristotle defines happiness as an activity of soul exhibiting virtue, not as a product or state of mind which follows action. A moral virtue, like arete, is a state of character which is acquired through habituation. For example, we become brave by performing brave actions. Vice belongs to the same category as virtue. It is a state of character, and it is acquired by repetition of vicious actions. For each virtue, there are two vices. For example, an excess of courage is rashness, and a lack of courage is cowardice. Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. Virtues can either be moral or intellectual. Moral virtues are acquired through habituation, and intellectual virtues are learned. Moral virtues are what makes us wish to perform virtuous actions. For example, if we possess the virtue of courage, we will wish to perform courageous acts. The most important intellectual virtue with regard to ethics is phronesis, practical wisdom. Phronesis is what allows the choice of the right means to accomplish the virtuous action we wish to perform. Each time we exercise a virtue, according to Aristotle, we are happy. But the virtuous activity of theoretical reason is the most noble for man. So that's eudaimonia, the gyroscope of flourishing and wisdom. Aristotle's theory of happiness is not fleeting pleasure, but the ultimate smooth, harmonious functioning of the entire psychological mechanism. True flourishing is the realization of the integrated self, bringing it together and having that gyroscope to maintain our balance. Phronesis. This is important. Hexis is Aristotle's habits of character, the habits. Phronesis is wisdom. Jungian attitude are the psychological types like thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. and introversion and extroversion and the combination of those things. Those are really what leads to that. So the anvil that we're striking to make it is hexis, the habits that we have. Then phronesis is the wisdom, the compass of which way to go. And then the Jungian attitudes are being our whole wheel here that gives us relationship to time, space, causality, all those things that Kant talked about. That's Aristotle started all that. Just as repeated habits forge a state of character, repeated psychological processes force our typological attitude. Phronesis, practical and ethical wisdom, acts as a master navigator, steering the mechanism through the chaos of the unconscious. Yes, so let's talk about this here. Aristotle's typology, the Jungian clinical challenge, operational will, how it happens, and the experience of suffering. So vicious, that's akalostos. That's a highly neurotic. The clinical stage is you're highly neurotic. You're just starting out. The operational, you have a defenseless ego dominated by amoral complexes. Aristotle's vicious individual could be compared, looking at things from a depth psychological perspective, to a highly neurotic person who is not yet aware of being neurotic, or at least does not entertain the possibility that his behavior may be in need of improvement. He or she is what he or she is. Like Aristotle's vicious type, the highly neurotic character is incurable. His actions are in accordance with choice. He has no regrets, except perhaps unconscious one. Jung would say that his morality is repressed. So he projects everything outward. He's unconscious of his shadow, and he sees it in his kids or his partner or his colleagues that he works with, the boss. The acratic could indeed be compared to the neurotic individual who has begun a path of self-knowledge, but who still needs to rely heavily on the ethical transference to gain moral strength. So he borrows the ego from the therapist. Perhaps she has not yet begun analysis, or perhaps she is in the first stages of analysis. The conflict within herself is one way or another. The conflict within herself, in one way or another, has reached consciousness. In depth psychological terms, the acratic is someone who has begun recognition and integration of the shadow. Thus, she is curable, even if she is quite often unable to come to terms with her unconscious. John Beebe, the famous person, writes about this. The decision to approach the shadow involves anxiety, doubt, shame, and a desire to repair the relationship with another whose needs I have somehow missed. My recognition of the need to look at shadow starts with the painfulness, a stoppage, an absence of a sense of well-being, and an agitation from within to feel okay again. Or I can be feeling too good and realize that I am secretly afraid. This type of suffering experienced by the acratic individual could be defined in Jungian terms as neurotic suffering. Yes, the acratic, early stage patient, intellectual awareness of the shadow, but weak willpower. They haven't developed those habits of doing it yet. The habit of analysis isn't part of their repertoire yet. They're just starting out. Neurotic suffering relies heavily on ethical transference, temporarily borrowing the analyst's moral strength. Yes. Incratic, and that's the mid-stage person. Yes. See here. Incratic can be likened to a person who has begun analysis for a sufficient amount of time and who is capable of confronting his or her shortcomings even without the help of the analyst. The incratic could be compared to the adapted moral individual in Jung's paradigm who has a strong will and who is capable of integrating unconscious contents without letting himself be engulfed by them. He has doubts, but the doubts do not impair his ability to act. He is strong and can withstand the tension of the opposites. This type of suffering experienced by the incratic individual could be defined in Jungian terms as suffering which is natural, necessary, and legitimate. Yes. Strong ego, battling the shadow, but resisting full integration. That's the operational will. Goal development, endurance, holding the tension of the opposites until creative solution emerges. Could be through his journal, could be through dream work, could be through active imagination. All these techniques could be through family therapy, working couples therapy. It doesn't have to always be individual. And then the virtuous person, sploderos. That's the individuated person, which we maybe don't actually get there. They have a harmonious ego-self axis, and ego-self axis was first discussed by Erich Neumann, who I mentioned earlier, but it was made more popular, and the term was actually really coined by Edward Edinger, the analyst from LA, Los Angeles, who talked about the ego-self. And the ego-self axis is that the ego is supposed to be the prime minister, but the self is the king. Who does the ego serve? It serves the true capital S self. If the ego thinks he's the boss, then we're going to have this whole master-slave problem going on. Wholeness over perfection. There's an old saying that the great rug makers of the Middle East always leave a little mistake in their rug because wholeness is more important than perfection. Integrating the raw, amoral powers of the self. The self don't give a damn. The self don't care. He just wants you to be your true self. But the ego has to decide what is really moral in our everyday pit of the world, our human example, under the responsible guidance of a conscious ego. And for me, with the help of Marilyn Nagy, she confronted me like that bee. Okay. So, bridging the fragmented camps. The Kantian duty, the Nietzschean vitality, and the Christian Aristotelian virtue. Yes, let's talk a little about that. 3 of them. Post-Jungian scholars often read Jung as in a one-sided manner. Colacicchi provides that Jung successfully bridges these two tensions. Kantian consciousness, Nietzschean self-assertion, and Aristotelian character development operate together within a cohesive, pluralistic framework. The new ethic of the individual. Now, what is Phronesis, ethical wisdom? In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle states that the degree of precision we should expect in ethics is inferior to the one we may expect in scientific matters. The differentia of virtue is a disposition to choose the intermediate, the mean. Phronesis in Aristotle is the capacity to understand the ethical situation, and finding the mean, the balance point, requires a full, detailed acquaintance with the circumstances. Aristotle writes that such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. The person with phronesis knows which actions are conducive to the good life. She deliberates well, judges well, and perceives the world as she should. She recognizes opportunities for courage, temperance, and so on. She also knows how to hit the mean. For example, she knows when and what she should face, and when and from what she should flee. That leads us to individuation, which individuation has to come with the integration of the shadow. That's a really important point. Individuation is not selfish retreat. It is agonizing, necessary, ethical task to prevent the unconscious from blindly acting out its destructive potential in the world. The shadow is the moral psychology of evil. As Jung says, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. Furthermore, it is constantly in contact with other interests, so that it is continually subjected to modification. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness. At all events, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. Jung also says, nobody who finds himself on the road to wholeness can escape the characteristic suspension, which is the meaning of crucifixion, for he will infallibly run into things that thwart and cross him. First, the thing he has no wish to be, the shadow. Second, the thing he is not, the other, the individual reality of the you. And third, his psychic non-ego, the collective unconsciousness. Jung also says in 1951, to know where the other person makes a mistake is of little value. It only becomes interesting when you know where you make the mistake, and then you can do something about it. We can isolate various aspects of the shadow with these definitions. Namely, this is what the shadow is, what determines it, what it does to us, and what we can do about it. The shadow is something inferior, primitive, childish, unadapted, awkward, not wholly bad. We all have it. It is the thing we have no wish to be. It is a moral problem. It is a relative evil. It includes normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. What determines the shadow is an archetype, a psychic structure from which, for Jung, belongs to mankind in general. So ultimately, God or biochemical chance is the source of the shadow. And it is also a complex, meaning it's a collection of ideas and images to form a relatively independent part of the individual psyche. So the complex are the things that triggers us. And we have to deal with those in order to develop individuation, become our true self. What the shadow does to us is it determines a split in our personality, and an intensified shadow will produce a neurosis, where we unconsciously project on the outside world what we are unconscious about in ourselves. And what can we do about our shadow? Is to recognize it as present and real, make it conscious, recognize the projection, become aware of our own mistakes and of our inferior, unadapted, awkward, and childish and primitive side. By doing so, we will no longer live in the world which is the replica of our unknown face. We will have a real relationship with the world, and our existence will be vitalized and embellished. In terms of the analogy of shadow and sin, Jung's optimism towards the possibility of integrating our shadow is closer to a Catholic approach to sin, where reason and good deeds are seen to mitigate our fallible nature, and further away from the Pauline, Augustinian, and Protestant approach to sin. Jung was aware that Protestantism, with its more direct relationship with God and the unconscious, was both a risk and an opportunity, and most of his patients were Protestants. He noted his notion of integrating the shadow, or sin, with the help of a mediator, the analyst, can be seen as an injection of Catholic optimism, embodied by a Catholic confessor-like figure, the analyst, into a darker Protestant soul. Here it is perhaps interesting to note that one of the most accurate interpreters of Jung's psychology was a Catholic priest, Father Victor White. Yes. And the shadow might not be the same as evil, but it's related to it. Now, integrating that is step one, what we really need to do in order to establish individuation. Individuation is not a selfish retreat. It is an agonizing, necessary ethical task to prevent the unconscious from blindly acting out its destructive potential on the world. See, blindness here, the new ethic of the individual. And finally, clinical flow to wholeness. Our patients do not present with philosophical puzzles. They arrive with divided souls. By understanding the psyche as a deeply ethical mechanism, we move beyond mere symptom management. We're not trying to put a Band-Aid on. We're trying to deal with the depth of the person in their soul. Armed with this integrated typology, we can guide families and individuals out of neurotic stagnation and into profound, dynamic flow of wholeness, of becoming our true self. So sometimes, if we do that, we might have an empty office. We might have healed our clients and they no longer need this, which every therapist is trying to work their way out of a job. Thank you very much. Again, this is Dr. Brian Lippincott, and I'm your professor, and I hope you learned a lot about philosophy of Kant, Nietzsche, Aristotle, and how they impacted the knowledge and the understanding of Carl Jung and his whole psychology. So, this is Dr. Brian Lippincott signing off. If you have any questions, you can ask me after class, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave me a comment in the below, and I will return all the comments and answer your questions. Thank you very much. Dr. Lippincott signing off.